everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Emily Walker with the U.S. Embassy Algiers. I am very pleased to introduce a talk that we're having today called The Civil Rights Movement with an esteemed guest, our Deputy Chief of Mission. Before we do that, I want to tell you a little bit about what I do at the U.S. Embassy. I oversee the cultural centers that are around Algeria. We have the American Cultural Center Algiers, or the ACCA, which is hosting this talk today. We also have American Cultural Centers in other locations, including Oran, Constantine, Orgala, and Bishar. So I very much encourage you, if you're located near any of those cities, to check out those centers once they reopen. Yes, our Deputy Chief of Mission. We have Before we do that, I want to tell you a little bit about We have some really cool programs at our centers, including talks like you're about to hear. We also have conversation clubs, entrepreneurship programs. You can check out English language books and DVDs, and you can practice your English. So there's lots of really cool things going on there. So for today, like I said, we're going to hear a talk on the civil rights movement in America. And our esteemed speaker is Gautam Rana, who's our Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Algiers. His previous posts have included Slovenia, India, Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, and the UAE. Prior to joining the Foreign Service in 2002, Mr. Rana was a public defender in New York City and a civil rights fellow with the National Asian Pacific American Legal Consortium. Gautam has varying levels of proficiency in many languages, including Hindi, Gujarati, Spanish, and Arabic. He has degrees in economics and international relations from the University of Pennsylvania, a law degree from Vanderbilt University, and a Master of Arts in Strategic Security Studies from the National Defense University. Gautam is married and he lives here in Algiers with his 2 kids. So I'm going to turn it over to Gautam.
Thank you very much, Emily, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you to the Public Diplomacy team for organizing this event. And thanks to all of you out there for joining in this very, very important conversation. I should note that I am calling from my home, and I've got 2 little ones running around in the background. So during the course of this conversation, you might hear them, you know, they always like to participate in these types of talks. As you all know, over the last 2 weeks, there have been numerous protests throughout the United States that began after the horrific killing of George Floyd. Racism and discrimination are not unique to the United States, but are a universal problem, and I think all people and nations struggle with it. To understand where the United States is now, I think requires us to understand where we've been and to discuss the idea of America itself. The history of modern America begins with the first permanent European settlement in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. I say modern because Native American populations first arrived to what is now North America approximately 15,000 years ago, and possibly earlier. It was the establishment of the European settlements in the 1600s that led to the creation of the United States of America in 1776. The first African slaves were brought to the colonies in 1619 to Jamestown. Throughout the 1600s, European settlers turned to African slaves as a cheaper, more plentiful labor source than indentured servants who were mostly poor Europeans. According to professors David Eltis and David Richardson, 12.5 million Africans were brought to North America, the Caribbean, and South America as slaves. They estimate that approximately 400,000 were brought to America. Though the United States abolished the slave trade in 1808, the domestic slave trade continued and slavery existed until after the end of the American Civil War in 1865. During the 1600s and 1700s, enslaved Africans worked primarily on plantations along the southern coast. After the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, cotton became the primary product of the South, increasing the use of slave labor. Between 1774 and 1804, all the northern states abolished slavery. By 1860, the enslaved population of the United States reached approximately 4 million people. It's also important to note that when originally written, the men who wrote our Constitution included what is known as the 3/5 clause, which set the census value of a slave as 60% of the value of a free person. Slavery, as I noted, existed in the United States mostly in the South, only in the South, because the North did abolish it until 1865. The American Civil War was fought primarily about slavery. There are some historians and others who argue that there were other reasons for the conflict, but I believe the weight of the historical evidence, especially from primary sources prior to 1861, demonstrate that it was about slavery. I won't get into the details of the conflict, but during the war, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, which declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are henceforth shall be free. After the war, our Constitution was amended by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which ended slavery and were designed to ensure equality for recently emancipated slaves, including the right to vote. However, in the post-civil rights Civil War era, many Southern states implemented what were called Jim Crow laws, which limited the rights of African Americans to vote and own property, prohibited interracial marriage, and permitted the separation between races in public and places of business. In 1896, the US Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the doctrine of separate but equal. So they basically said that you could have two schools, and as long as they were equal, they could be separated by race. Further, the various discriminatory laws prohibited African Americans from voting, prohibited them from owning property, kept them in certain areas where they could live, on buses and in public spaces. They were kept separate from the white population. All of this history led to the African American civil rights struggle of the 20th century. I think it's really important to note two points. First, Black Americans have struggled for their freedom and equality since the first slaves were brought to America. I don't have the time or scope to go into all of this, but it's important to acknowledge that the struggle for equality is as long as the history of slavery. Two, racism and discrimination were not a uniquely Southern phenomenon. It occurred throughout the United States, and racist beliefs were widespread. The civil rights struggle of the 20th century focused primarily on equality under the law, with the hope that over time, attitude towards race could be changed. Since the civil rights movement was extremely complex and widespread, I will focus my comments primarily on Thurgood Marshall and Dr. Martin Luther King. The two work in complement with each other. Thurgood Marshall and his organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, commonly referred to as the NAACP, focused on a legal strategy, while Dr. King focused on changing the laws and public opinion. Thurgood Marshall, his mentor Charles Hamilton Houston, and the NAACP began to systematically attack racially discriminatory laws in the courts beginning in the 1930s. Marshall argued 32 cases before the Supreme Court, winning 29, as the NAACP successfully fought laws against a variety of discriminatory practices. His most famous victory was in 1954, when the Supreme Court, in a famous decision called Brown versus the Board of Education, essentially overruled separate but equal, particularly in education. Building on this case, and again, a number of others, over the next decade, the Supreme Court dismantled many of the discriminatory laws that had been implemented after the Civil War. Thurgood Marshall is one of the greatest American heroes. After his work as a lawyer, he later became the Solicitor General of the United States and the first African-American appointed to the US Supreme Court. So while Thurgood Marshall led the legal fight, Dr. King led the nonviolent protest movement of the 1950s and 60s that ended public facilities being segregated by race in the South. He also mobilized public opinion to achieve the most important equal rights legislation since the end of the Civil War. As I previously noted, African Americans have long advocated for their freedom, but the civil rights movement gained strength after the notorious lynching of a Chicago teenager, Emmett Till, in Mississippi in 1955. Till's mother decided to have an open casket funeral, and which mobilized the African American community nationwide when they saw what had been done to this poor young boy. The following year, in 1956, Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to follow the law that required African Americans to go to the back of a public bus and was arrested. Dr. King lived in Montgomery and organized bus boycotts, which were followed by protests throughout the South and a wide range of other nonviolent activities. In 1963, Dr. King led the March on Washington to advocate for the economic rights of African Americans. It was one of the largest political rallies for human rights in the history of America and culminated in Dr. King's historic "I Have a Dream" speech, which called for an end to racism. Dr. King received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 at the age of 36. Now, I've given you just a very, very brief overview because in the interest of time, I'd rather have a discussion and answer your questions. But the result of the civil rights struggle was a series of laws, the most important of which was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So you have to understand, in the scope of American history, you had slavery until 1865. After 1865, the Constitution was amended, which in theory allowed for equality under the law. But nevertheless, discriminatory laws were put in place, which were then upheld by the Supreme Court and other courts. And then these existed for approximately 100 years. Then the African American civil rights struggle brought about both a legal and public opinion change towards these laws. All of this resulted in a series of legislation, series of laws in the 1960s. In particular, as I noted, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act protected women from discrimination, outlawed segregation in public accommodations, schools, and employment, and outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So what do we owe this struggle? The Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution are amazing documents, and they outline an aspirational vision of the United States. They explain who we want to be. But we as a nation didn't live up to the ideals of the Declaration and Constitution without true equality for all American citizens. Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But this can't be true until it applies to everyone, man or woman, no matter their race or creed. America, I would argue, was incomplete until the work and legacies of Dr. King, Thurgood Marshall, and the countless other reformers, black and white, who made our nation whole. And for me, this is not just a theoretical exercise. I am here today representing the United States of America as the Deputy Ambassador of the US Embassy in Algiers because of the Civil Rights Movement. I was born in India and my family immigrated to the United States when I was 4.5 years old. But the only reason my family could come to the United States was because of the Civil Rights Movement. Prior to 1965, US immigration law essentially did not permit non-Europeans to go to the United States. Directly because of the Civil Rights Movement, the law was changed in 1965, allowing for global immigration. Not only did the law permit my family to come to the US, but because of the Civil Rights Movement, my family and I did not suffer discrimination to vote, own property, or have an education. I truly believe America is the greatest country in the world. My family has lived the American dream. I have lived the American dream. And I'm immensely grateful for the opportunities and freedoms we've had. But we've been able to live our version of the American dream because of the countless reformers who fought for freedom and equality. I and every immigrant in the United States, every minority, are the beneficiaries of their blood, sweat, and sacrifice. And further, all Americans owe them a great deal of gratitude because they allowed our country to live up to our ideals. And what does this mean going forward? Just because the laws have changed does not mean the struggle has ended. Racism and discrimination continue to exist in the United States. Empirical data on a wide range of issues, employment, housing, health, life expectancy, and interactions with the police demonstrate wide disparities based on race. But America was the first nation in the world founded on an idea. The idea, of course, was democracy. And America has always been an experiment. And Americans have always aspired to the line found in our preamble to our Constitution to create, quote, a more perfect union. This process is ongoing and will likely never stop. We can appreciate the greatness of America, but there is always more to be done. And we are in a period right now with the death of George Floyd that has oftentimes happened in our past where we confront our ideals, our notions of what we ought to be with the reality of what we are. These struggles are never easy and often painful, but again, we have a long history of protest where we, the people, demand change. And if you look at the evolution of America from 1607 to today, I would argue that it is one of the most fair and just societies in the world today, with plenty of work still to be done to make it more fair, and more just for all. The great Dr. Martin Luther King said, quote, "The moral arc of the universe bends towards justice," end quote. And it means that the road to achieve equality is long and would not be one singular moment. The struggle continues, it always will, but I have faith that over time, we can create a more just and fair society for all of our citizens, that we can achieve a more perfect union. I'll stop with my prepared remarks at that point, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you all may have.
Thank you so much, Gautam. That was a very concise history for something covering such a long period of time and so many very crucial events. You mentioned that prior to 1965, your family wouldn't have been probably welcome in the US. You wouldn't have been able to move there. I'm interested in hearing a bit more about your family story, why you moved to the US, what you moved for, and sort of your development in America, if you would.
Sure. Yeah, it's not even that we would have wanted to go to the United States. The laws would not have permitted my family to go to the United States. There were a few non-European people in the United States prior to 1965, but there were few, not many. After the laws changed, frankly, our story it's a really interesting one. The other element that happened with my family and with a lot of other immigrants, particularly with science backgrounds post-1965, was Sputnik. In 1957, the Russians launched a satellite into space. And America believed that it was losing the space race, the technology race. So when the law was changed in 1965, there was also a great deal of premium placed on people with education. And so when my dad applied for his visa, he had a background in science. He had a master's degree in chemistry, and they gave him a visa because of his background and because of his educational experience. But he also had been working in India, we weren't wealthy, we were not a family of means. And he arrived in the United States with $20 in his pocket, lived there for 3 years by himself. My family, my sisters, my mom and I were still in India, worked really hard. My family came over 3 years later. My parents worked really hard all of their lives. And the one thing that they ingrained in us from the day we came to the United States was the importance of education. That with an education, anything is possible. And this is where, again, I come back to the notion of the American dream, all the work that had come before us. We were able to go to the public schools in the community we had immigrated to. I personally can't recall, being discriminated against, being segregated, and we were allowed these opportunities because of all the work that had been done before us. We were able to live in suburban communities. My family was able to own property. And so all of this at the time we took for granted, but looking back, all of this had happened because just a decade before, Martin Luther King and Thurgood Marshall and all these other people were fighting for these rights that we were able to take advantage of.
Thank you. And following on with that, we just got a question on YouTube from Tufik, who wants to know your opinion on why the civil rights movement, as we call it, the actual movement, happened in the 1950s and 60s, and why not earlier? Do you have any thoughts on?
It's a good question. I have to defer more to the historians about that than I can answer. I think part of what happened, and I'm speaking off the cuff a little bit here, so bear with me. I think after the Civil War, there was a period of retrenchment where, again, you had these amendments put in place, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which are very far-reaching. They basically do permit equality under the law. But I don't think America was ready for it at that point in time. And I think the southern states in particular who had lost the war very quickly found ways to reinstitute discriminatory laws, which unfortunately the Supreme Court upheld. I think by the time the mid-1900s rolled around, African Americans had enough, They were angry. I think the world had also changed after World War II. America was the most dominant country in the world. There was also a great deal of movement after the war, particularly World War II, where labor had moved all over the country because of the war effort. I think for a number of reasons, all of these, and also I think extraordinary leaders. I think the fact that you had a Thurgood Marshall, a Martin Luther King, a Rosa Parks, all of these people and so many more come together at a certain place and point in time in history allowed for those types of changes that were going on. You know, also, what happened in the 1950s and 60s was happening globally. You had these types of revolutions going on all over the world. It's the post-independence period. Algeria, of course, is fighting your own struggles. India had become independent in 47. Gandhi had led that movement with nonviolent protests. So I think it was a culmination of where the world was and astonishing confluence of leadership at one time.
When you first came to the US, do you remember learning about the civil rights movement in school, or do you remember hearing any part of it that just really stuck with you, surprised you, left an impression?
Absolutely not. And this is, I think, this is part of the struggle. And this is part of, I think, what the change has taken place in the United States. I don't recall ever studying about it at all in elementary school or high school. I learned about it more in college, and then I think more, frankly, afterwards. I think the version of American history that I learned was very focused on the European settlers and the experience of the European colonists, and the Native American population, the African American population was just completely ignored. I don't think that's true today. I hope it's not. I believe a lot of change has taken place just in the last few decades, where there's a realization that these movements were essential and absolutely critical for America to truly become a more just society.
Thank you. This question came in on Facebook from Masood Job, and he says, he points to what you just spoke about, the United States racist founding, starting with genocide of Native Americans and slaves from Africa. With these racist issues in America's history, how can the US appoint itself a policeman for human rights? That's what Masood Job would like to know.
Yeah. Thank you, Masood, for that question. So I think the important thing, you raise, I think really interesting, provocative questions. I'll go back to what I noted in my presentation. We have these incredible ideals for ourselves as a nation, and they're incorporated in our Declaration of Independence and in our Constitution. And our history is flawed. I think every nation in the world has some elements of its past, some elements of its present that if we were going to be honest with ourselves, we would acknowledge is incorrect, unjust. And so we've struggled with this. Many people have called slavery America's original sin. And I think it absolutely is, that this was an appalling part of our history that A, we have to acknowledge, and B, I think we have worked on over hundreds of years to overcome. But I think, and the struggle continues. It's not that you just reach an endpoint and everything is over and everything is great. I think, we will constantly have to deal with the struggle and constantly try to live up to our ideals. And I think that's what it means also for the world. Human rights are universal. Every nation in the world has signed on to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And there's a number of covenants, international political covenants, that almost every nation in the world has signed on to. These are UN covenants. So for example, against the discrimination of women, protection of children, and things like that. So these are universal rights. It's not that the United States is a world policeman, right? When we engage with countries all over the world, we have these discussions about rights that we've all signed on to, that we all believe apply all over the world. And so I don't think we're the world's policeman. I think we have these conversations with our partners all over the world to discuss their issues as we discuss our own very openly.
Thank you for that. We just got a question on YouTube from Abdallah, who would like to know, as a US citizen and a diplomat, have you ever lived anywhere where you experienced overt or not so overt acts of racism?
Sure, absolutely. Look, I'll be honest. I do not look like an American diplomat. If I were to walk in a room with the rest of my colleagues and we were not to introduce ourselves and we were to ask most people who are the American diplomats, I probably would not be chosen because there is an expectation you're going to be white or even maybe African American. And but we're America is this hodgepodge. There are people from every country in the world there, and it is increasingly becoming what is called a majority minority. People of all races, nations, whatnot, have become American citizens and become a part of the fabric of America. Overt discrimination, no, but every diplomat of color has their stories of when they're on the consular line, when we're doing visas, and when we tell an applicant who's applying for a visa, or even American citizens, and we have to give them bad news, we'll get some sort of remark like, well, I want to speak to the real American. And we've all faced this. I had this on the line. I've walked into meetings with with other colleagues, American diplomatic colleagues who are all white. And even though I may be the most senior officer among us, our colleagues who may be fellow diplomats, fellow world travelers, will address all of the remarks towards my white colleagues because they're the American diplomats. I'm either support staff, or even if I'm a diplomat, I must be some sort of junior person. So this is common. I think I could tell you many other stories. Many other diplomats of color have experienced this, but we're changing the face of the diplomatic corps. I think people realize America is a multicultural place, and over time, I am confident that these stories will be relics of the past.
Can I ask you, what do you do? What is your reaction when somebody, say, in a meeting discounts you and they don't know that you're our deputy ambassador at our embassy? How do you react in that situation?
Well, I think it depends on the situation. I'll be most honest. I'll be honest. I'm most angry when I've heard that from fellow American citizens. I think when dealing with foreign counterparts, we're diplomats. We're paid to be diplomats. And discrimination of any kind for anyone, I don't care who you are in the world, it hurts, and you're going to sit there and be upset about it. But I think part of the job as a diplomat is to just do your job. I do frankly believe it's toughest when it comes from our own, when people who we feel should know better, American citizens, say these types of things to us. But I think every single person will respond in their own way. And for me, it's always, you sort of have to take a step back, take a deep breath, and then try to do your job as professionally as possible.
Thank you for that. This question comes from Technology, who wrote his question on YouTube, or her question. Technology wonders what you think about, basically they're asking if the key to peace and I suppose racial harmony is to have equity in senior positions. You're in a senior position at our embassy. You're the Deputy Chief of Mission. So do you think, or do you have any ideas about making sure that senior positions in the government and at companies are more equitably split between whites and minorities?
Well, I think it's part of it. I don't think. I think. Okay, this is a complicated question, and I mean, I think what technology is asked for, it's a good question. Thank you very much. Is how do we sort of overcome all of this? Part of it, yes, is to have the role models. Part of it is to have people in senior positions who everyone can look to, especially minorities and maybe communities that haven't necessarily been in positions of power and importance before, and to be able to look at them and say, wow, I too can achieve this. Absolutely. I think that's important. It's definitely a part of the process. I think far more important is what's going on right now in the United States. George Floyd's death was horrific. It's a tragedy. It never should have happened. But it forced us to have some very difficult conversations, and those conversations continue. And this has happened in the past, where protests and events have led people to advocate for their beliefs, and it results in hard conversations. But hard conversations are necessary to get us to where we want to be. And I think we're seeing that in the United States right now, where people across the nation, of race, color, creed, whatnot, are taking a look at themselves, at their communities, and thinking, how can we make it better? Now, this is not just a problem for the African-American community, but how can we as a nation do better?
Thank you for that. So you just said hard conversations are necessary to get us where we want to be.
Yes.
But they're very hard, as you know.
Absolutely.
But in America, I think right now we are more willing to have these conversations. But I'm wondering if you have any tips for perhaps young people who might be watching this talk now, working in civil society, like how to start broaching a conversation that is very difficult. Maybe you can give some tips for how you do this in the workplace, or how you do this with friends or family.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. It's a very good question. I don't know if there's a one size fits all. I think one of the things that that you have to do is sort of think before these conversations about, I'll focus on discrimination and race, because I think that's what we're talking about, the conversation that we're having in the United States. And I think what a lot of people are doing is, where do I fit into this, right? I mean, that we're talking about, a tragedy that befell an African-American man in Minneapolis, Minnesota. But how can I be part of the solution? How can I be someone who helps us become a better country? And that, I think, involves honest reflection, honest sort of understanding of one's own place in society and what one can do. And then beginning those conversations, I think, for your average citizen, maybe with other people in your community, maybe involvement in local politics, maybe involvement in local movements, to see what you can do on a local level. And then these go up, from the local to the state to the national level in the United States. So I think it first begins with oneself. I mean, Gandhi said famously, if you want to change the world, oh my goodness, I'm blowing the quote right now, but if you want, I'm sorry, what he said, this is what he said: become the change you want to see in the world. And so what he's getting at, and I think what I'm trying to explain not so well, is try to become that change. Look at yourself, see what you want to become, see how you want to be part of the solution, and work towards becoming that, if that makes sense.
Yes, I'm wondering if you have any recommendations, if people either want to learn more about the civil rights movement in the United States or what's happening now in the United States, if you have any recommendations of maybe movies or podcasts. You can also practice your English while you're.
Yeah, good questions. I'd have to come back to you guys on movies. I think there are some really great documentaries on the civil rights movement, and I think the work that's been done over the last few decades. But what I would strongly recommend just starting with is maybe anything that Dr. Martin Luther King wrote. He's a brilliant, brilliant writer. And one of the things that pops, in my mind is his letter from Birmingham jail. I think it's one of the most important documents that was, written in American history. And so maybe starting with something like that, and maybe, let me think about this, and maybe we can add something after the podcast, maybe to our Facebook page, where we can maybe list some books and podcasts and movies. I'll be honest, and I'll give you a very modern critique of a lot of Hollywood movies that have been done about the civil rights movement. They tend to be how white people suffered so much during the Black civil rights movement. So I think it's important to sort of, when we look at movies and documentaries, to look at it from those advocating for change, not necessarily so much from Hollywood trying to sell you a product.
A good point, a good suggestion for all of our watching of movies that come out of America, I think too. This question just came in on YouTube from Tufik, and he wonders if you have some comments or thoughts on how the civil rights movement, how the use of violence in the civil rights movement compares to how we're seeing violence in today's protests in America.
Yeah. So I think one of the reasons it was so phenomenally successful was that Dr. Martin Luther King advocated and used nonviolence. This was, of course, based on the same ideas and principles that Mahatma Gandhi used in India, widespread nonviolent protests. And so you did have elements within the broader struggle who did use violence. I think on the whole, if you look back at that time period, there were marginal elements. They were rejected both by the majority population and even within the African-American community. I also find, I think when you look at someone like Malcolm X, who is, again, one of the most famous protest leaders, who went on his own sort of personal voyage from being more radical, advocating for the use of violence, to someone who very much came around to Dr. King's ideas. He also famously became a Muslim, did the Hajj. And so I think Malcolm X, was maybe emblematic of someone who I think maybe saw that this wasn't effective and that Dr. King's methods were far more effective. I think that's also true today. I don't think violence is effective. I think there's a lot of questions right now about violence, how widespread it is, and who's doing it. And it's a debate that I think I don't really have time to get into the complexity of. But I think the most successful elements of these last 2 weeks have been the nonviolent protests and the large number of them that have taken place throughout the country, both the size in our major cities as well as the breadth. That there have been protests in every state in the union, including states which are overwhelmingly white, including Utah, West Virginia, and in small towns all over the country. So this has moved beyond, I think, just a small segment of the population to a much larger part of the population who are saying, hey, we need to relook at where we are as a nation. And we do this constantly. And this is part of what it is to be American, and I think part of the American experiment.
Thank you. This question just came in on YouTube from Chauki Lebek, who wants to know, what solutions do you propose internationally to confront racial discrimination? So perhaps more specifically, what you're doing as a diplomat, or how diplomacy can confront racial discrimination.
Yeah, I mean, I think every country has to approach it in their own way. I can't offer a solution for Algeria or any of the other countries that I've lived in. I think this is something that each country has to look at, and because of your own unique circumstances, your own unique societies, and to be able to sort of figure out what's best for you. What I would say, and what I think has been universal, is one, again, I point to the UN Declaration of Human Rights and all these other covenants that all countries have signed around the world, that we all believe that discrimination and racism are wrong. And so we're all starting from at least that point, that it's wrong, right? So that's a good thing. And then how do we go about advocating for change? One, I think, to use the Gandhi and King model, nonviolent protests, being able to make your case to your governments, to your own people. I think communities forming at a local level to begin these hard conversations, to see how you can make local change, and then to go from local again to maybe broader geographic areas. But I think the worldwide models that others have used in the past are very applicable to all countries and all nations. But again, they have to be tailored to their own unique circumstances.
How important do you think freedom of speech is in being able to have these kind of protests and being able to advocate for change?
I can speak about that again from an American perspective, which is that it's essential, right? I mean, it is the very first amendment to our Constitution, where we hold that freedom of speech is one of the most important rights that any of us have as human beings. And so for the American context, I think, again, it's essential to our notion of ourselves as a nation. It's essential to our freedoms as citizens. And it's essential to, I think, our political processes, that people can speak openly and criticize governments. I think, again, all countries around the world have signed on to these international documents. And so, people should exercise that right, as appropriate within their countries, along with exercising your right to vote, because I think that's one of the most important elements of speech, is being able to go out there and to tell a government how you feel, whether it's positively or negatively.
Thank you. This question just came in from Asma on YouTube, and she wants to know if so a lot of us diplomats spend most of our lives living abroad. We're not living in the US most of the time. Asma would like to know, do you still think the US is a good place for you to raise your children, considering what is going on there now?
Absolutely, and I can say that unequivocally. So I've had the privilege, and it is a privilege, of over the course of my life, I've now lived in 10 countries, and they've all been wonderful in their own ways, all have different sets of challenges. There are things, I think, again, struggles that maybe are universal, struggles and challenges which are more local. Maybe I'm biased because I'm an American citizen and now I'm an American diplomat, but I do truly believe that the United States is the greatest country in the world because of our freedoms and our opportunities. The challenges that we face, and I should also note, I take this nothing away from any other country. I hope all Algerians believe your country is the greatest country in the world, and have that sort of a patriotic belief for your own countries. So again, I mean, don't disrespect to any other country, but I truly believe that the country I grew up in and that of which I am a citizen of is the greatest country in the world, and because of our freedoms and opportunities. And yes, I absolutely, part of my job, because of my job, I do, and I will continue living abroad, but I have no hesitation of ever going back and raising my kids in the US. I think I'm trying to raise them as proud Americans, teach them about our country, again, our flaws, as well as the things that we've done well, because I think it's important to be honest. And then also, hopefully, as they get older, to be able to teach them how to be good citizens, that it's important for them not to take our values and the things, our opportunities for granted, that each of us, every citizen, has a responsibility to make our country better. And so hopefully I can teach that to them too.
Gautam, just a few more questions. I mentioned in your intro that you worked as a public defender in New York City before you became a diplomat. Could you explain a little bit about what that job is, and also what inspired you to become a diplomat? Sure.
So a public defender is someone who represents criminal defendants for free. In the United States, we have a Supreme Court decision, I believe it's 1962, makes it a constitutional right for every criminal defendant to have an attorney. Because in the past, sometimes people who were too poor couldn't afford their own attorney, and then would be accused of a crime and would have to try to defend themselves against the government, which has all these resources, the police, public prosecutors and whatnot. So the court basically said this is unfair, that everyone deserves representation. If the state's going to put you in jail, take away your freedom, then every single person should have an attorney representing them through this process. In the United States, every state has a different way of handling this. In New York, where I worked for the Legal Aid Society. It's an organization where everyone works for on behalf of poor indigent clients. I enjoyed the work. It was challenging. It was interesting. But I also have always been very interested in international relations. I studied it as an undergraduate, even when I was in law school. I studied international law quite a bit. I had been in the Peace Corps after college, and I'd always had a great deal of interest in policy work. So at some point in my life, I had actually taken the exam a couple of times, but wasn't quite ready to become a diplomat. And then after practicing for a few years, I was ready. I enjoyed my work, but I couldn't imagine living in the same place doing the same work for the rest of my life. So if I'm going to be absolutely honest with you and all my other friends out there, part of my motivation was boredom. That I wanted to see the world, do different things, and I kind of felt that if I had continued doing what I was doing, I was going to be bored. Not that the work wasn't important, not that the work wasn't interesting, but it wasn't me. And so I went through the process, got the offer, and I joined soon after 9/11, and bounced around the world a little bit. And I have to say, it's been the best job I've ever had. Been able to live in a lot of different places. I've had a chance to do all different types of work. You meet amazing colleagues. I think our diplomatic corps, again, I'm being biased, but I think it's the best diplomatic corps in the world. We have fantastic colleagues here in Algeria and in Washington and all over the world. And the other really great part of it is you get to meet other people. I've always said that the best part of my job is that I get paid to go off and learn other languages, understand other cultures, and meet people from all over the world. And I get paid to do this, right? And I will say that of the various countries that I've been to around the world, my wife and I have talked about this quite regularly. We put Algerians at the top of the list in terms of their friendliness, their engagement, and just the people here are so remarkably warm. It's been an absolute delight living here in this country and learning more about Algeria. And probably the best part of it is being able to interact with Algerians, who are, again, absolutely amazingly warm people.
Thank you. The final question I was going to ask are your perceptions of Algeria, which you just covered a little bit. So maybe you could talk about, you're here for another 2 years, right?
Yes.
Maybe talk about things you want to do in those 2 years in Algeria. And if you wanted to throw in a little Arabic or Darija in there, I'm sure.
Oh, no, not going to work. I've been trying to work. No, it's not going to work. It's I haven't not been practicing languages at all since COVID started. So this is going to be really bad. So the biggest thing, the most important thing I'd like to do over the next couple of years, frankly speaking, is I really want to travel. I feel that too much of my work over the last year, and then again, because of COVID and everything else, I've been here in Algiers. Algiers is great. It's been fun exploring this town. And I've been able to get out a little bit. I got down to Tindouf. My family went to Oran. We got down to Garadaya. And so we've been able to do a little bit of traveling, but I really would love to explore more of Algeria. We definitely want to go to Constantine, but also more of the South, to learn more about the various parts of this country. I really want my kids to be able to see it. They are studying some Arabic and French along with English. And I think it'd be great for them to be able to practice a little bit and see the rest of this beautiful country. The other part of it is food. There's some really great food all over this country. I love food. And so I think being able to go off to the various parks, cities and smaller towns throughout this country and be able to try out regional delicacies and to see, to see them, but also to see what people like to eat down there. I think that'd be really fun.
What's your favorite Algerian dish?
It's going to be, it's a little bit, standard, but I do like couscous. So I'll stick with the Goldie but oldie.
Okay, well, Gautam Rana, Deputy Chief of Mission for the U.S. Embassy Algiers. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and interest in the civil rights movement with the audience on YouTube. This video is going to stay on YouTube after it's done being live, so people can come back and watch it. We will work on putting subtitles on it, which some have requested. And we'll also, on the YouTube page, share links to other articles, podcasts, movies that deal with the civil rights movement. So thank you guys so much for watching us on YouTube. Please subscribe to our channel. And Gautam Rana, thank you so much again.